But life wasn't just about the family they were raising. Greg and Emma still made time for each other, even as parents, to nurture the love that had brought them together in the first place. They'd steal moments for themselves, an impromptu date night, an afternoon walk, or quiet conversations after the kids were tucked in bed. They knew that without the foundation of their relationship, everything else would fall apart. So they worked at it just as much as they worked to build their family. Years passed, and their children grew. Lily, Greg's niece, had become an important part of their family, often coming over to visit. She had grown into a young woman with a heart as kind as her mother's, and she loved seeing her uncle's transformation. She would often say, with a knowing smile, that Greg had been her role model, not the rebellious uncle, but the man who had become everything she admired. One day, as they sat around the dinner table, Greg looked at Emma, their children laughing and arguing playfully, and he realized that their love story was still unfolding. They weren't just living in the happy ending. They were building a life together, one moment at a time, and each moment mattered. And then, as if time had slowed down, Greg thought back to the first day they met, how Emma had walked into that bar, bright and full of life, and how, in that instant, everything had changed. He couldn't imagine where he'd be if she hadn't entered his life, hadn't believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, a small gesture, but one that held all the love and gratitude in his heart. "Thank you for choosing me," he whispered, the words full of the depth of their journey together. Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling, and responded with the same truth that had carried them through all these years. "I didn't just choose you, Greg. I chose us." As the years stretched on, their bond remained unbreakable. The love that had started with a simple conversation in a bar between a rebellious man and a hopeful woman grew into something far more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. It was a love built on second chances, on growth, on understanding that no one is ever defined by their mistakes, but by the choices they make moving forward. And as they grew older, Greg and Emma looked back on their story with a sense of peace. They knew they had lived their truth and had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. Together, they had built a life that was rich with love, full of challenges, but always anchored in the certainty that their love was enough to face anything that came their way. The bad uncle who once couldn't see his worth had become the man he never thought he could be, the man who loved fiercely, who gave everything to his family, and who finally believed, deep down, that he deserved the life he had. And all of it, every moment, every choice, was worth it for the woman who had loved him through it all.
There was a man named Greg, known in his small town for his somewhat mysterious and rebellious nature. Greg was in his late 30s, tall with shaggy brown hair, a couple of tattoos peeking out from beneath his sleeves, and a crooked smile that often gave off an air of mischief. His reputation preceded him. He wasn't the most reputable man in town. He often made poor decisions, was notorious for his wild nights out, and had a reputation for breaking hearts. Greg was someone people avoided, the kind of guy who always had a story or two that ended with someone getting hurt. But even with his rough edges, Greg had his own complicated charm. Underneath the surface, he had a kind heart, though no one ever really saw it. He had his reasons for acting the way he did, things that no one ever knew. Greg had grown up with a hard life. His father had been a harsh and distant figure, while his mother had passed away when he was young. He learned early on that it was easier to stay distant and avoid getting hurt by forming connections. He wasn't the kind of man to settle down, and that included keeping people at arm's length, even his own family. He had a young niece, Lily, who he'd occasionally see, but he was often too caught up in his own world of mistakes to be much of an influence on her. Enter Emma, a sweet, independent woman in her early 20s who had recently moved to the town. She worked at the local bakery and had an energy that contrasted Greg's darkness. Emma had grown up in a nurturing family and had always been taught that love, kindness, and loyalty were the keys to happiness. She was the kind of person who could brighten a room with a smile and had an uncanny ability to see the good in people, even when they didn't see it themselves. She had heard the rumors about Greg, stories about his troubled past, his many failed relationships, and his stubborn refusal to settle down. But Emma didn't believe in judging people based on their past. She liked to think that everyone had the potential for redemption, even someone like Greg. One evening, Greg was at the bar after another long day of running errands and dealing with family drama. He was nursing a drink, staring blankly at the television, when Emma walked in to meet some friends. She immediately caught Greg's attention. Her laughter was infectious, her eyes bright with life. He found himself drawn to her, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Their first conversation was brief. Greg, being the quiet and guarded man he was, didn't know how to approach her. But Emma was different. She didn't judge him for his reputation. She asked him a few questions, and before long, they were talking like they had known each other for years. She didn't seem scared of his rough exterior, and she smiled with sincerity, which made Greg feel something deep inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Weeks passed, and Emma and Greg found themselves seeing more of each other. Their connection grew stronger, but Greg's darker past was always there, lurking in the background. Emma's friends warned her about getting too close to someone like Greg, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Greg, for his part, was equally confused. He'd never been in a relationship that felt this real. He had no idea how to handle someone who was so good to him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was something special. But Greg's old habits didn't die easily. He was still a man who made poor decisions, and his temper sometimes flared when he was stressed or drunk. He would disappear for days, avoid his family, and keep his distance from Emma, thinking that pushing her away would be better for her in the long run. Every time he tried to leave her, Emma would gently pull him back. She would text, call, and show up at his door, reminding him that she was there and that they could face things together. One evening, things took a turn when Greg got into a fight with some old friends, and Emma was caught in the middle. He had been drinking, and things escalated quickly. In the heat of the moment, he pushed Emma away, and for the first time, she left. That was the moment Greg realized just how much he cared about her. Emma didn't come back that night, and Greg sat alone, surrounded by the consequences of his actions. He wasn't sure if he deserved her, but he knew he couldn't live without her. The following days were filled with regret. Greg sought help from his sister, Lily's mother, and began to work on his demons. He knew that if he didn't change, he would lose the only good thing he'd ever had. Emma's absence made him realize just how much she meant to him. He had been running from love for so long, but now he wanted to fight for it. When he finally found Emma, he was nervous. He had never been good with apologies, and he wasn't sure if she'd take him back after what had happened. But Emma, as always, had an open heart. She listened to his sincere apology and understood that people can change, but it takes time and effort. Greg promised her that he would work on becoming the man she deserved, the man who could love her without pushing her away. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Greg had to fight against his own demons, and Emma had to learn how to navigate a relationship with a man who had a difficult past. But they grew together. Greg started to find healing in his own way, seeking therapy and confronting his past instead of burying it. Emma stood by him through it all, offering him support when he needed it and giving him the space to grow. Over time, Greg became a better version of himself, not perfect, but better. He started to repair his relationship with his family, especially with his niece Lily, who became an important part of his life. Emma and Greg's love blossomed into something real and lasting. They didn't have the perfect love story, but it was their story, one full of healing, growth, and second chances. They eventually moved in together, and as time went on, Greg proposed to Emma in a small, quiet ceremony at the very bakery where they had first met. Their love was no longer about the imperfections and mistakes of the past, but about the future they were building together. A future full of hope, growth, and above all, love. Greg was no longer the bad uncle or the man who ran away from his emotions. With Emma by his side, he was finally the man he had always wanted to be. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. As Greg and Emma settled into their new life, their love continued to deepen in ways neither of them had expected. Greg, once a man who lived in shadows, found himself shedding layers of guilt and regret. It wasn't a smooth journey. Old habits sometimes reared their heads, and there were moments when Greg doubted himself, wondering if he was truly worthy of Emma's unwavering love. But Emma, ever patient and understanding, reminded him that the past didn't define them. They were creating a future together. Their days were filled with the simplicity of building a life. Greg found a steady job at a local construction company, something that gave him both purpose and a sense of pride. Emma, always the optimist, cheered him on every step of the way. They spent weekends exploring the town and taking quiet walks in the nearby park, talking about their hopes and dreams. They laughed, they cried, and they learned more about each other every day. Though Greg had become a better man, his past still lingered. It wasn't easy for him to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was trying to be. He had occasional moments of doubt, but Emma was there to remind him that he wasn't defined by the mistakes of his past. She believed in him, sometimes more than he believed in himself. And slowly, Greg began to believe it too. Then, one chilly autumn evening, something unexpected happened. Lily, Greg's niece, reached out to him. She had grown up a lot in the years since they had reconnected. She had heard the stories about Greg, about the man he used to be, but she saw the changes in him. She reached out to Greg not with a question, but with an invitation. She wanted him to be a bigger part of her life. She knew Emma was part of the reason why her uncle had turned things around, and Lily wanted him to know how proud she was of him. Greg's heart swelled with emotion. For years, he had felt like a failure, unable to be the kind of uncle Lily deserved. But now, with her words, he realized he had a chance to rewrite that story. The old wounds didn't vanish overnight, but they were healing. For the first time in a long time, Greg allowed himself to believe that he could be someone better, not just for Emma, but for Lily and his family too. Months passed and the seasons changed. Greg and Emma's love remained steadfast, and soon they found themselves talking about the possibility of starting a family of their own. It wasn't something they had planned at first, but the thought of building a future together, a family, a home, felt like the natural next step. They began to dream about a life full of love and warmth, with children of their own running through their house, filling the rooms with laughter. As they talked about their future, Greg realized how far he had come. The man who had once pushed everyone away, afraid of being hurt, was now embracing the possibility of a different kind of life, one rooted in love and connection. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. With Emma by his side, he felt ready for whatever life had in store. One evening, after a long day, Greg and Emma sat on their porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. They were holding hands, enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. It was in this peaceful moment that Greg turned to Emma, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me, for loving me when I didn't deserve it, for giving me a chance to be the man I never thought I could be." Emma squeezed his hand, her smile soft and sincere. "I didn't just believe in you, Greg. I believed in us, in who we are together. You've shown me that love can change people, and I love the person you've become." Greg felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace he had never known before. In that moment, he realized that Emma wasn't just the love of his life. She was his anchor, his rock, the one person who had never given up on him. And somehow, he had found the courage to be the man who would never give up on her. In the years that followed, Greg and Emma built the life they had always dreamed of. They welcomed children into their world, their home filled with laughter, chaos, and the kind of love that only grows deeper with time. Greg still had his rough edges, but he no longer felt the need to hide them. He was open about his past, about the mistakes he'd made, and about the journey that had brought him to where he was. And Emma, who had stood by him every step of the way, loved him not in spite of his past, but because of the strength and growth it had brought him. Together, they faced the ups and downs of life, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could weather anything. The bad uncle who had once pushed people away had transformed into the man who could love unconditionally, who could be a good husband, a good father, and a good uncle. And through it all, he never stopped being grateful for the woman who had seen the good in him, who had loved him through the darkest of times, and who had changed his life forever. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was messy, it was painful at times, but it was always full of heart. And in the end, that was enough. Because together, they had created something beautiful, something lasting. A love that defied the odds and proved that sometimes, the greatest stories of all come from the ones that take the longest to write. As the years passed, Greg and Emma's bond continued to flourish. Their home was now filled with the sounds of children's laughter. Two kids, a boy and a girl, who had inherited their mother's infectious optimism and their father's mischievous smile. Greg had become the father he never thought he'd be capable of being, and Emma had proven to be the constant, loving presence that their children needed. But even in the midst of their growing family, the past never truly faded. Greg often found himself reflecting on the man he used to be, the man who pushed people away and lived with guilt. Sometimes, in moments of quiet reflection, he'd catch himself wondering if he truly deserved the happiness he had now. But Emma, ever intuitive, would notice these moments. She'd quietly sit beside him, offering a gentle reminder of how far he had come. "You've earned every bit of this," she'd tell him, taking his hand and looking him in the eyes with that same unwavering love that had first drawn him in. "We've earned this." Together, these words, simple yet profound, always seemed to bring Greg back to the present. His family, the life he had built with Emma, was the greatest gift he could have ever imagined. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he would continue to fight to be the man they deserved for as long as he lived. But life wasn't always without its challenges. Parenthood, like any journey, had its ups and downs. Greg's past sometimes resurfaced in subtle ways. Old friends from his wilder days would occasionally come knocking, offering him a taste of his former life. There were nights when he felt the pull of his old habits, a longing for the carelessness he once knew. But each time, Emma's steadfast presence reminded him why he had chosen to change. One particular night, after a long day of work and parenting, Greg came home to find Emma sitting by the window, a book in her lap, her gaze lost in thought. It had been one of those days. His patience had been tested by work and family stress. The weight of his past threatened to cloud his mind, and for a brief moment he wondered if it was all too much to handle. But as he watched Emma, her calmness in the midst of chaos, he felt a surge of gratitude. He sat down beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and simply sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough," he confessed quietly, staring at the floor. "Enough for you, for the kids, for this life we've built." Emma turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. "You're everything we need," she replied, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "You've already proven that, Greg. In every moment, you've shown us that you're more than enough." Greg's heart tightened with emotion. Emma had been his light when everything seemed dark, the person who had helped him find a new version of himself. Every day, she showed him that love wasn't just about who you were, but who you could become. And he had become a man he could be proud of because of her.